There are moments in a person's life when they realize that everything they thought they understood about death, dignity, and the sacred nature of final rest was merely the surface of something far more complex and disturbing. I have carried such a moment with me for 7 months now, and only today, as I sit in my new position at Riverside Memorial Gardens, 200 miles away from Whitmore Son Funeral Home, have I found the courage to put these events into words. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I am a licensed funeral service assistant with 8 years of experience in mortuary care. Before that night in December, I had always prided myself on my professional composure, my attention to detail, and my unwavering respect for the deceased and their families. I had prepared over 1,500 bodies for their final rest, had comforted countless grieving families, and had witnessed the full spectrum of human mortality from peaceful natural deaths to tragic accidents. I thought I understood the boundaries between life and death, between the sacred and the profane, between what should be honored and what should remain hidden. I was wrong. The events I am about to describe took place during my final night shift at Whitmore Son Funeral Home, a family-owned establishment that had served the community of Millbrook for over 90 years. The funeral home was housed in a stately Victorian mansion built in 1889 with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and the kind of architectural dignity that made families feel their loved ones were being cared for in a place of genuine reverence. The building consisted of 3 viewing rooms, a chapel that could accommodate up to 100 mourners, the preparation room where I spent most of my working hours, and the business offices on the 2nd floor. I had been employed at Whitmore Son for 6 years, working primarily the evening and overnight shifts when the funeral home was closed to the public. My responsibilities included embalming, cosmetic preparation, dressing and positioning the deceased, and maintaining the preparation room and its equipment. It was solitary work, but I found it meaningful. Every person who came through our doors deserved to be treated with dignity and care, regardless of the circumstances of their death or the size of their funeral service. The funeral home was owned and operated by Gerald Whitmore Sr., a third-generation funeral director whose grandfather had founded the business in 1934. Gerald was a man in his early 60s, professionally competent but increasingly distant from the day-to-day operations. His son, Ethan Whitmore, had recently joined the business after completing his mortuary science degree, though he seemed more interested in the financial aspects than the service aspects of funeral care. My shift on December 18th began like any other. I arrived at 6 p.m. to find 3 bodies scheduled for preparation: an elderly woman who had died peacefully in her sleep, a middle-aged man who had suffered a heart attack, and a young woman named Emily Harper who had been killed in a car accident 2 days earlier. The first 2 preparations were routine, completed by 10:30 p.m. with the meticulous care I had developed over years of practice. It was Emily Harper's case that would change everything I thought I knew about my profession and about the people I had trusted with my career. Emily Harper was 26 years old, a local teacher who had been driving home from a faculty meeting when her car skidded on black ice and struck a tree. According to the police report, she had died instantly from massive trauma, though the damage was primarily to her torso and internal organs. Her face was largely unmarked, which would make the viewing easier for her family. She was scheduled for a funeral service in 3 days, with viewing hours beginning the following afternoon. I began Emily's preparation at approximately 11:15 p.m. The funeral home was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of the building settling and the low hum of the refrigeration units. I had prepared hundreds of accident victims over the years, and while each case was tragic, I had developed the professional detachment necessary to focus on providing dignity and comfort to the grieving family rather than dwelling on the circumstances of death. As I began the initial examination, I noticed something unusual about Emily's injuries. While the police report indicated she had died from blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed collision, the pattern of injuries didn't quite match what I would expect from the described accident. There were bruises on her wrists and ankles that appeared to be ligature marks, suggesting she had been restrained at some point. More disturbing were the small puncture wounds on her neck, barely visible, but clearly present under magnification. I documented these observations in my preparation notes, as was standard procedure for any unusual findings. In cases involving potential criminal activity, funeral homes are required to report suspicious injuries to the appropriate authorities. However, when I mentioned my concerns to Ethan Whitmore, who was working late in the office that evening, his response was immediate and emphatic. "Daniel, I need you to focus on the preparation and not on playing detective," he said, his tone sharper than I had ever heard from him. "The police have already completed their investigation. Emily Harper died in a car accident, and that's what her death certificate says. Our job is to prepare her for her family, not to second-guess the authorities." I was taken aback by his response, but I returned to my work, though the unusual injuries continued to trouble me. As I proceeded with the embalming process, I discovered additional inconsistencies. Emily's blood showed signs of chemical contamination that I couldn't identify, and there were internal injuries that seemed inconsistent with the external trauma pattern. Most disturbing of all, when I examined her more closely, I found what appeared to be surgical incisions that had been carefully sutured and concealed. At 1:47 a.m., I was interrupted by the arrival of two men I had never seen before. They entered through the rear entrance of the funeral home, using keys and moving with the familiarity of people who had been there before. Ethan Whitmore met them in the hallway outside the preparation room, and I could hear their conversation through the partially open door. "Is it ready?" one of the men asked. His voice was cultured, educated, with the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. "Reyes is still working on the preparation," Ethan replied. "He's been asking questions about the injuries. I told him to focus on his job, but he's thorough, maybe too thorough." "We can't have complications," the second man said. "This needs to be clean. No questions, no investigations, no problems." "I understand," Ethan said. "But Daniel has been with us for 6 years. He's reliable, professional. He won't cause problems if we handle this correctly." "See that he doesn't," the first man replied. "There's too much at stake here, too many people depending on this staying quiet." I moved away from the door, my heart pounding as I tried to process what I had heard. The conversation suggested that Emily Harper's death was not the simple accident it had been reported to be, and that Ethan Whitmore was somehow involved in covering up the truth. I returned to my work, but my hands were shaking as I tried to maintain my professional composure. 20 minutes later, Ethan entered the preparation room, accompanied by the two strangers. Both men were well-dressed, middle-aged, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested wealth and influence. The taller of the two, who seemed to be in charge, approached the preparation table where Emily's body lay. "Daniel," Ethan said, his voice carefully controlled, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Malcolm Avery and Mr. Preston Langford. They're here to observe the preparation process." I nodded politely, though something about the situation felt deeply wrong. In my 6 years at Whitmore Son, I had never had strangers observe a preparation, and certainly not in the middle of the night. Dr. Avery moved closer to the table, examining Emily's body with the clinical detachment of someone familiar with post-mortem examination. "The preparation is proceeding normally," he asked, though his question seemed directed more at Ethan than at me. "Yes," I replied, finding my voice, though I did notice some unusual injuries that might warrant further investigation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Avery and Mr. Langford exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret, but Ethan's expression was one of barely controlled panic. "What kind of injuries?" Dr. Avery asked, his tone carefully neutral. I hesitated, sensing that my answer would have consequences I couldn't foresee. "Ligature marks on the wrists and ankles, puncture wounds on the neck, and some internal inconsistencies that don't match the reported cause of death." Dr. Avery nodded slowly, as if my observations confirmed something he already knew. "Mr. Reyes, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I can assure you that these findings are not as unusual as they might appear. Miss Harper's accident was more complex than the initial reports indicated. She was trapped in her vehicle for several hours before rescue workers could extract her, which accounts for the ligature-like marks from the seatbelt and debris. The puncture wounds are from glass fragments, and the internal injuries are consistent with the crushing forces involved in the collision." His explanation was delivered with the authority of medical expertise, but something about it felt rehearsed, as if he had prepared these answers in advance. More troubling was the way Mr. Langford was watching me, his eyes never leaving my face, as if he were evaluating my reaction to Dr. Avery's words. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. "I'll complete the preparation according to standard procedures." "Good," Dr. Avery said. "And Daniel, I hope you understand that Miss Harper's family has been through enough trauma. They don't need additional distress caused by speculation about her injuries. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is allow people to grieve without unnecessary complications." The implication was clear. I was being told to keep quiet about what I had observed. Ethan nodded in agreement, and I realized that my employer was complicit in whatever was happening here. "Of course," I said. "The family's peace of mind is always our priority." Dr. Avery smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm glad we understand each other. Ethan tells me you're one of his most trusted employees. I hope that trust is well placed." The three men left the preparation room, but I could hear them talking in low voices in the hallway. I tried to focus on completing Emily's preparation, but my mind was racing with questions and fears. What had really happened to Emily Harper? Why were these men so concerned about covering up the truth? And what would happen to me if I didn't cooperate with their demands for silence? As I worked, I began to notice other details that hadn't been apparent during my initial examination. Emily's fingernails had been recently manicured, but there were traces of what appeared to be skin and blood beneath them, suggesting she had fought against her attacker. Her clothing, which had been cut away by the emergency responders, showed tears that were inconsistent with accident damage. Most disturbing of all, when I examined her more closely under magnification, I found what appeared to be injection sites on her arms and neck, carefully concealed but unmistakably present. At 3:22 a.m., I made a decision that would change the course of my life. Using my phone, I began photographing the injuries and inconsistencies I had discovered. I knew I was violating company policy and potentially putting myself at risk, but I also knew that Emily Harper deserved justice, and her family deserved the truth about how she had died. I had just finished documenting the injection sites when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly, I put away my phone and returned to my work, but my heart was pounding so loudly I was certain it could be heard throughout the building. Ethan entered the preparation room alone, his expression grim. "Daniel, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. I continued working, trying to appear calm and professional. "What about? About what you've seen tonight? About what you think you've discovered?" He moved closer to the preparation table, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I need you to understand something. Emily Harper's death is not what it appears to be, but it's also not what you think it is." I stopped working and looked at him directly. "Then what is it?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Emily was involved in something she shouldn't have been, something that put her in danger. Her death wasn't an accident, but it also wasn't murder in the way you might think. "What do you mean?" "She was working with some people, providing information about certain activities in town. When those activities were discovered, she became a liability. The people she was working for decided she needed to disappear, but they wanted it to look like an accident to avoid investigation." I felt sick to my stomach. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about a situation that's more complicated than you can imagine," Ethan said. "Emily knew the risks when she got involved. She made choices that led to consequences. Our job now is to make sure her family can grieve in peace without learning the truth about what she was doing. Her family deserves to know how she really died. Her family deserves to remember her as the person they thought she was, not as someone who was involved in activities that would destroy their memory of her." Ethan's voice was growing more urgent. "Daniel, there are people involved in this situation who have the power to destroy lives, to ruin careers, to make problems disappear. If you try to expose what happened to Emily, you won't just be putting yourself at risk. You'll be putting everyone you care about at risk." The threat was implicit, but clear. I was being told that my silence was not optional. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Complete the preparation. Do your job. Forget about the inconsistencies you think you've found. Let Emily Harper rest in peace, and let her family grieve without additional trauma." I nodded, though every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong. "And if I don't?" Ethan's expression hardened. "Then you'll find that your career in mortuary science is over, not just here, but anywhere. The people involved in this situation have connections throughout the industry. They can make sure you never work in funeral service again." After Ethan left, I stood alone in the preparation room with Emily Harper's body, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. I could complete the preparation, keep quiet about what I had discovered, and allow a murder to be covered up. Or I could try to expose the truth and face the destruction of my career and potentially my life. As I struggled with this decision, something happened that changed everything. At exactly 4:17 a.m., the lights in the preparation room flickered and dimmed. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Most unsettling of all, I heard what sounded like a woman's voice, barely audible but unmistakably present, calling my name. "Daniel." I turned toward the sound, but the preparation room was empty except for Emily's body on the table. The voice came again, clearer this time, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the preparation table. "Daniel, please help me." I approached the table slowly, my heart pounding. Emily's body lay exactly as I had positioned it, but as I watched, her lips seemed to move slightly, as if she were trying to speak. "Emily?" I whispered, feeling foolish but unable to ignore what I was experiencing. "They killed me," the voice said, and this time I was certain it was coming from Emily's body. "They killed me, and they're going to get away with it unless you help me." I stood frozen, torn between rational disbelief and the evidence of my own senses. In 8 years of working with the deceased, I had never experienced anything like this. Yet the voice was clear, desperate, and unmistakably real. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Tell the truth. Show them the evidence. Don't let them bury the truth with my body." The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the temperature had returned to normal. Emily's body lay motionless, showing no sign of the impossible communication I had just experienced. But the message was clear. I had been chosen to be Emily Harper's voice, to ensure that her murder would not go unpunished. I spent the remainder of the night completing Emily's preparation, but my mind was focused on the evidence I had gathered and the decision I had to make. By the time my shift ended at 7 a.m., I had made my choice. I would not be complicit in covering up Emily Harper's murder, regardless of the consequences. Before leaving the funeral home, I made copies of all the photographs I had taken and the notes I had made about the inconsistencies in Emily's injuries. I also gathered samples of the contaminated embalming fluid and other physical evidence that might be useful in a criminal investigation. I knew I was taking enormous risks, but I also knew that Emily Harper deserved justice. Over the next 3 days, as the funeral home prepared for Emily's viewing and service, I researched the men I had encountered that night. Dr. Malcolm Avery was a prominent physician who served on the boards of several local hospitals and medical organizations. Mr. Preston Langford was a successful businessman with interests in real estate, construction, and local politics. Both men had reputations for philanthropy and community service, which made their involvement in Emily's death even more shocking. I also learned more about Emily Harper herself. She had been a dedicated teacher, beloved by her students and colleagues, with no apparent connection to criminal activity. However, further investigation revealed that she had been dating a man named Ryan Mercer, who worked as an accountant for several of Langford's businesses. If Emily had discovered evidence of financial impropriety or illegal activities, she might have become a threat that needed to be eliminated. The funeral service was held on December 21st, 3 days after my disturbing night shift. I attended the service, both to pay my respects to Emily and to observe the behavior of the people involved in her death. Dr. Avery and Mr. Langford were both present, offering condolences to Emily's family with apparent sincerity. Ethan Whitmore conducted the service with his usual professional dignity. showing no sign of the stress and fear I had witnessed that night. Emily's family was devastated by their loss, but they seemed to find comfort in the belief that her death had been a tragic accident. Her parents spoke about her dedication to her students, her plans for the future, and their gratitude that she had not suffered in her final moments. Watching their grief, I understood why Ethan and the others wanted to maintain the fiction of an accidental death. The truth would indeed cause additional pain to people who were already suffering. But as I sat in the chapel, listening to the eulogies and watching Emily's closed casket, I could not forget the voice I had heard in the preparation room. Emily Harper had asked me to tell the truth, to ensure that her murder would not go unpunished. I owed her that much, regardless of the cost to myself or the additional pain it might cause her family. After the service, I made contact with Detective Natalie Cruz, a homicide investigator with the County Sheriff's Department. I had worked with Detective Cruz on several cases over the years, and I trusted her integrity and competence. I arranged to meet with her privately, away from the funeral home and away from anyone who might be watching. Detective Cruz listened to my account with professional skepticism, but when I showed her the photographs and physical evidence I had gathered, her expression grew serious. The injection sites, the ligature marks, the inconsistencies in the injury patterns, and the chemical contamination of Emily's blood all suggested that her death had not been accidental. "This is substantial evidence," Detective Cruz said, "but it's also going to be difficult to pursue. The body has been buried, the death certificate has been filed, and the case has been officially closed. Reopening the investigation will require significant justification and will likely face resistance from people with influence and resources." "I understand," I said. "But Emily Harper deserves justice, and her family deserves the truth." Detective Cruz nodded. "I agree. But you need to understand that if we pursue this investigation, you're going to face serious consequences. The people you've identified as being involved in this cover-up have the power to destroy your career and possibly your life. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Emily's voice in the preparation room, about her desperate plea for help, about the injustice of allowing her murder to go unpunished. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared." The investigation that followed was complex and dangerous. Detective Cruz worked carefully and quietly, gathering additional evidence and building a case that could withstand the legal and political pressure that would inevitably come. Her first step was to conduct a thorough background check on all the individuals I had identified, looking for connections and patterns that might explain their involvement in Emily's death. What she discovered was a web of corruption that extended far deeper than either of us had initially suspected. Preston Langford's business empire was built on a foundation of fraudulent contracts, money laundering, and political bribery. He had been systematically overcharging the city for construction projects, using substandard materials while billing for premium ones, and paying kickbacks to city officials to ensure his bids were accepted. Ryan Mercer, Emily's boyfriend, had been the accountant responsible for managing the financial records that concealed these illegal activities. His embezzlement had been discovered not by Emily, but by an internal audit that Langford had ordered when he suspected someone was skimming money from his operations. When Mercer realized he was about to be exposed, he had panicked and confessed everything to Emily, hoping she would help him figure out a way to escape the consequences of his actions. Emily, being the ethical person she was, had been horrified to learn about the extent of the corruption. She had urged Mercer to come forward and cooperate with authorities, promising to support him through the legal process. But Mercer was terrified of Langford's reputation for dealing harshly with people who crossed him. Instead of following Emily's advice, he had made the fatal mistake of confessing his situation to Langford directly, hoping to negotiate some kind of deal. Langford's response had been swift and ruthless. Rather than face the possibility that Emily might convince Mercer to expose the entire operation, he had decided that both of them needed to be eliminated. Dr. Avery had been brought in because of his medical expertise and his own financial dependence on Langford's business empire. Avery's private practice had been struggling financially, and Langford had been providing him with lucrative consulting contracts that kept his medical practice afloat. The murder itself had been carefully planned and executed. Emily had been lured to a meeting under the pretense that Mercer wanted to discuss their future together. Instead, she had been drugged, restrained, and subjected to what Dr. Avery had described as experimental procedures designed to extract information about what she knew and who she might have told. When it became clear that Emily had not shared her knowledge with anyone else, she had been killed through a combination of drugs that would be difficult to detect in a standard autopsy. The car accident had been staged using Emily's own vehicle, with her body positioned to make the crash appear authentic. Dr. Avery had used his medical knowledge to ensure that the injuries from the staged accident would mask the evidence of the torture and murder that had preceded it. The puncture wounds I had discovered were from the needles used to administer the drugs, and the ligature marks were from the restraints used during her interrogation. Detective Cruz's investigation revealed that this was not the first time Langford had eliminated people who posed a threat to his operations. Over the past 5 years, 3 other individuals who had discovered evidence of his illegal activities had died in what appeared to be accidents or suicides. In each case, Dr. Avery had been involved in either the medical examination or the death certification process, and Ethan Whitmore's funeral home had handled the preparations without raising questions about suspicious injuries or circumstances. The pattern was clear. Langford had developed a systematic method for eliminating threats to his criminal enterprise, using his connections in the medical and funeral service industries to ensure that the murders would not be detected or investigated. Emily Harper had simply been the latest victim in a series of calculated killings designed to protect a multi-million-dollar criminal operation. The evidence was compelling, but the investigation faced obstacles at every turn. Witnesses disappeared or refused to cooperate. Physical evidence was lost or contaminated. Legal challenges were filed to prevent the exhumation of Emily's body for additional forensic examination. It became clear that the conspiracy to cover up Emily's murder extended far beyond the 3 men I had encountered that night. During this period, I faced exactly the kind of retaliation that Ethan Whitmore had threatened. I was fired from my position at Whitmore Son, ostensibly for violating company policies regarding confidentiality and evidence handling. The termination letter cited unprofessional conduct and breach of trust, language that would follow me to every potential employer in the funeral service industry. When I applied for positions at other funeral homes, I found that my reputation had been systematically destroyed. Potential employers were told that I was unreliable, that I had mental health issues, that I could not be trusted with sensitive information. Phone calls I had expected to receive were never returned. Interviews that had been scheduled were mysteriously canceled. It became clear that Langford's influence extended throughout the professional networks that controlled employment opportunities in my field. The harassment extended far beyond my professional life. My apartment was broken into on 3 separate occasions, though nothing was ever stolen. The intruders seemed more interested in searching through my personal belongings and leaving subtle signs of their presence than in taking anything of value. I would come home to find furniture slightly moved, drawers opened, papers disturbed. The message was clear. I was being watched, and my privacy was no longer my own. My car was vandalized repeatedly. Tires were slashed, windows were broken, and on one particularly disturbing occasion, I found a dead rat placed on my driver's seat with a note that read, "Keep your mouth shut or join your friend." The police reports I filed were taken seriously by the responding officers, but the investigations never led to any arrests or even viable suspects. The phone calls began shortly after Detective Cruz's investigation became known to the people involved in the conspiracy. They came at all hours of the day and night, sometimes with explicit threats delivered in voices I didn't recognize, sometimes with offers of money to drop my cooperation with the investigation. The callers seemed to know details about my daily routine, my family members, and my financial situation that should have been private information. One particularly chilling call came at 3:17 a.m., exactly the same time that Emily's supernatural communication had occurred in the preparation room. The voice was electronically distorted, but the message was clear. "We know where your sister works. We know where your parents live. We know about your nephew's school. Stop helping the police, or they'll all pay for your mistakes." The psychological pressure was enormous. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows. varying my daily routines to avoid establishing predictable patterns that could be exploited by people who meant me harm. Sleep became elusive, and when I did manage to rest, I was plagued by nightmares about Emily's voice calling for help and my own inability to protect the people I cared about. Despite these pressures, I continued to cooperate with Detective Cruz's investigation. She arranged for me to be placed in a witness protection program that provided some measure of security, but the isolation was almost as difficult to bear as the threats had been. I was relocated to a safe house in a different county, given a new identity for daily use, and instructed to avoid contact with family and friends until the investigation was complete. The safe house was a modest apartment in a nondescript building, furnished with the kind of generic furniture that could be found in any budget hotel. I spent my days reading, watching television, and trying to process the events that had led to my current situation. The isolation gave me time to reflect on the choices I had made and the consequences they had brought, but it also reinforced my conviction that exposing Emily's murder had been the right thing to do. Detective Cruz visited me regularly to update me on the progress of the investigation and to prepare me for the testimony I would eventually need to provide. She brought news of the obstacles the investigation was facing, but also of the breakthroughs that were slowly building a case against the conspirators. Her dedication to seeking justice for Emily gave me strength during the darkest moments of my isolation. The breakthrough came when Ryan Mercer, faced with mounting evidence of his embezzlement and his role in Emily's murder, agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided the final pieces of evidence needed to build a case against Langford, Avery, and Ethan Whitmore. The arrests were made on March 15th, nearly 3 months after Emily's death. Preston Langford was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to murder. Dr. Malcolm Avery was charged with murder, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Ethan Whitmore was charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. Ryan Mercer pled guilty to embezzlement and accessory to murder. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The revelation that a prominent businessman, a respected physician, and a trusted funeral director had conspired to murder a young teacher and cover up their crime shocked the community. The evidence I had gathered during that disturbing night shift proved crucial in securing convictions for all the defendants. Preston Langford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dr. Malcolm Avery received a sentence of 30 years to life. Ethan Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years for his role in the cover-up. Ryan Mercer, in exchange for his cooperation, received a sentence of 10 years. Emily Harper's family was devastated to learn the truth about her death, but they also expressed gratitude that her killers had been brought to justice. Her parents established a scholarship fund in her memory to support students pursuing careers in education, ensuring that her dedication to teaching would continue to benefit others. As for me, the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of my profession and my responsibilities. I learned that being a funeral service professional means more than simply preparing bodies and comforting families. It means being a guardian of truth, an advocate for the deceased who can no longer speak for themselves, and a protector of the dignity that every person deserves in death. The retaliation I faced for exposing Emily's murder eventually subsided, though it took months for me to find new employment in the funeral service industry. I was eventually hired by Riverside Memorial Gardens, where I now work under the supervision of directors who value integrity and ethical practice above convenience and profit. I often think about that night in the preparation room, about the voice I heard calling my name, asking for help. Some might dismiss it as stress-induced hallucination, as the product of a mind struggling to process traumatic information. But I know what I experienced, and I know that Emily Harper's spirit was present in that room, guiding me toward the truth that would bring her justice. The experience taught me that death is not the end of our responsibility to one another. The dead depend on the living to tell their stories, to seek justice for wrongs committed against them, to ensure that their lives and deaths have meaning. When we fail in these responsibilities, when we choose silence over truth, convenience over justice, we betray not only the deceased, but also the fundamental principles that make us human. I have shared this story not to sensationalize the events I witnessed, but to honor Emily Harper's memory, and to remind others in my profession of the sacred trust that is placed in our hands. Every person who comes through our doors deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and honesty. When we encounter evidence of wrongdoing, when we discover that a death was not what it appeared to be, we have a moral obligation to speak up, regardless of the personal cost. Emily Harper's voice in that preparation room reminded me that the dead are not truly silent. They speak through the evidence they leave behind, through the inconsistencies that careful observation can detect, through the moral courage of those who refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. As long as there are people willing to listen, willing to act, willing to risk their own comfort and security for the sake of truth, the dead will continue to find their voices.